Good afternoon. My name is Renee Vidalevsky, and I currently sit on the boards of Or Hadash and National Council of Jewish Women. On behalf of these organizations and Am Yisrael Chai, and with appreciation for the grant received by the Amiris Bank, I welcome you to this extraordinary program and opportunity to learn from a teacher and scholar whom we can only wish we had in our own schooling. Mr. Brendan Murphy is a history teacher at the Marist School and has taught there for almost 30 years. Early in his career, he identified the need to teach about the Holocaust in more depth than a mere mention in his world history course. As a result, he created a course on the topic. He created a course on the topic. To further impact and deepen the understanding of the Holocaust, he takes a group of students annually on a bearing witness trip to Europe, visiting key Holocaust sites. Additionally, every December, he and his students plant daffodils as part of Am Yisrael Chai's The Daffodil Project, which creates a living memorial to the 1.5 million children who perished in the Holocaust. Among Mr. Murphy's many awards and honors, he has received the Outstanding Educator Award from the Anne Frank Center for Mutual Respect in 2019, the Abe Goldstein Human Relations Award from the Anti-Defamation League in 2017, and in 2008, the Advanced Bearing Witness Fellowship through the Anti-Defamation League and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Why the Jews is a question most of us have asked many times over the course of our lives. Mr. Murphy, through this program, will help us to learn and understand the answers to that probing question. And now it is my distinct honor to introduce Mr. Brendan Murphy.
Okay, is that on? Yeah. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I can't tell you how much of an honor it is for me to be here with all of you. I've been to Or Hadash before. The one and only, many of you know her well, Margie Simonoff, had invited me to speak here, gosh, I don't know, maybe 8-10 years ago, in a very truncated version of what we'll be doing together today and tomorrow. Margie, I hope you are online. I think this is the yes, hi Margie. I hope that you're there with us today. Listen, it's funny, whenever someone introduces me like that, I always feel like I want to invite that person to come to Marist and introduce me to my students that way. That would be lovely. Can we turn the house lights down, Jason? Thank you. By the way, can I just mention, this is a lot of eye contact. It's making me a little nervous. As a high school teacher, I'm not used to people actually listening to me. So, sorry. I always tell that joke. It's so good, isn't it? It's good. It's good because it's true, regrettably. But seriously, if people often say, like, at the beginning of such a presentation, they'll say, please make sure your cell phones are on silent or otherwise put away. But really, in truth, it would make me feel right at home if you started talking on your cell phone and taking selfies of yourself while I'm speaking. That'd be great. I want to begin this afternoon by asking us to imagine that we could build for ourselves here in this beautiful space a time machine. I confess to all of you that as a history teacher, I often fantasize about this sort of thing. And we all rush inside and pile in shoulder to shoulder, and we dial up the year 1919, the beautiful city of Munich in Germany, and we press go, off we go. And we land moments later in the famous Marienplatz in the heart of that city. And so we get out, we walk around, stop in some of the side street cafes, get a cappuccino or two. And then we turn a corner down the Odeonplatz, and we come across a very old, very small, in fact, medieval synagogue. And we find that they're just about to begin a service. And so we go in. But at the exact same time, on the other side of Munich, there's a very different kind of meeting taking place.
Today, I will address something central to my thinking. Today, I will address the Jewish question. Not long ago, I was strolling when I suddenly encountered an apparition in a black kaftan and black helmet. And my first question was, is this a Jew? And then the more I stared, the more my first question assumed a new form. Is this a German? Is there any form of filth, particularly in cultural life, without a Jew involved in it? Because when you cut into an abscess, what do you find? Like maggots in a rotting body. With the appearance of the first settlement, the Jew is suddenly at hand. The stranger is given a friendly reception. He soon becomes an active part of the economic life of the settlement. He begins to lend money. Now the Jew is a steady resident. Commerce and finance have become his complete monopoly. He begins a second phase, where he begins to emphasize his Judaism less and his Germanism more. Yes, he becomes, if you can believe it, Germanic. Theater, religion, morality, wisdom, sermon dance, and endurance. But Joe comes up at final cloak and becomes the blood Jew. The tyrant who becomes the blood punish the people of Deutschland.
Who is that? Right. Hitler. This is when it started here in 1919. This is where it started here in Munich. Hitler having just returned home to Munich at the end of what was a complete disaster, at least for Germany, known as World War I. He came here to Munich to somehow scratch a living as an artist on the streets of Munich until he suddenly fell, quite accidentally, as it turned out, into local politics. This scene from a film called Max is a very, very carefully reconstructed scene of a very early Nazi rally, a very famous one, in fact, held at the Hofbrauhaus in Munich. This was that moment where Hitler became, well, Hitler. It was a turning point in his political career, a moment that launched him into the leadership position of the so-called Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, soon to become the so-called Nazi Party. And I should stress that what this actor, Noah Taylor, is saying in this scene are the actual words of Hitler himself. Much of what he said at this infamous meeting at the Hofbräuhaus survived. And so the writers of this film and the producer, director, they have woven Hitler's actual words into this scene in an attempt, as best as one might on film, to try to reconstruct what it was like to attend these very early Nazi rallies here in Munich. But the reason I wanted to show you this scene this afternoon is because for us it raises a question. It's a terribly simple question, but it's one with an exceedingly complex response. It's a question, moreover, I should stress, that takes us about 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks to kind of wade through in my Holocaust seminar class at Marist. We'll try to do this in a few hours together. It's this question here. Right, where does this homicidal hatred come from? Right? Why the Jews? This question will serve as our guide together today and tomorrow as well, parts 1 and 2. And my intention with us today is to kind of go through this presentation. Admittedly, we'll leave little time for Q&A, but I promise tomorrow we will finish about a half hour early for Q&A at the end. Best for us to make our way through this whole presentation before we together have a conversation about it. However, having said that, if there's some burning question inside of you as we move through this history together, please ask. But understand that I very well may say, we'll talk about that tomorrow, okay? Let me say too as well that wherever this question takes us together, both today and tomorrow, and I should say where it will take us will be a very dark path to be sure. What we'll be looking at is going to get very difficult, very heavy. This is a very dark and troubling past, as we know. But I promise you that I will work to bring us towards a place of hope. We need it, don't we? And I should stress as well that there's very good reason, despite how dark this will get, there is very good reason to be hopeful. And so we must come to that place. But we'll get there tomorrow. Okay? Take a look at this. This is an extraordinary photograph, especially, I think, if you consider its implications. It's this one here. This photograph was taken in the late spring, early summer of 1944, during the last frenzied months of operations at Auschwitz, where no doubt you're familiar. In the course of just a few months, the Nazis managed to kill well over 400,000 people, most of them from Hungary. And what you're looking at here is a crowd of Hungarian Jews having just been brought off of those cattle car trains, 3-day journey, you know the story. And they've just been brought off of those trains and they're standing here on the platform at Auschwitz. And if you look at this photograph, I think you can feel how they have no idea where they are or why they've been sent to this place. But of course, there, hovering above them, is the chimney to the gas chamber crematorium complex, number 2. 2 of 5 built in total at Auschwitz, where within about an hour, some 90% of these arrivees will be, in the Nazi euphemism, processed. That building is today little more than just a mound of rubble. The Nazis blew that building up in the last weeks of operations at Auschwitz as a kind of absurdist attempt to hide evidence of these crimes. I took this picture of one of my students from my Bearing Witness program at Auschwitz. One can only imagine her thoughts as she sits and journals in front of that mound of rubble. Those buildings were blown up, and the bricks fell, and they lay where they did, and serve as a memorial today. Not long after arrival, the Nazis conducted, of course, what are commonly referred to as the selections, where they would divide the crowd between those who would be deemed to work and those, of course, who would not. One of the common misconceptions about this moment of selection is that it was a kind of choice between life and death. That is not the case. Everyone who arrived here at Auschwitz was meant to die. Either you were killed immediately there in the gas chambers or you were effectively worked to death. And you can see the line here in the foreground of those who were not selected for labor is already here, well on its way in the background to that gas chamber crematorium complex. Hurry, the Nazi guards would say. The soup is getting cold. All the while, their belongings are already being loaded onto trucks into the background of that photograph, as you can see, to be taken to a rear area of the camp to be sorted, looted. These photographs, they come from an extraordinary collection of photographs, often referred to today as the so-called Auschwitz album. They consist of just about 200 photographs. We don't know why these photographs were taken. We know for sure that they were taken by a Nazi official at Auschwitz who had permission to take these photographs. Such photography, as you can well appreciate, was very strictly forbidden at places like these. The Nazis, of course, did not want such evidence to be shown, to be taken, but for some reason, some Nazi official had permission in the late spring, early summer of 1944 to take a series of photographs over the course of several days. Those photographs were developed and placed into a photo album that was quite miraculously found in 1946, sometime after the war had long since ended. Found, in fact, by a Holocaust survivor who recognized her family among those photographs, named Lily Jacob. She has since donated this photo album to Yad Vashem, the world's preeminent Holocaust institute and museum, where these images, of course, are very carefully cared for by a professional team of archivists, because, of course, these photographs are a precious historical resource. They provide for us an insight into the inner workings of this terrible place. And for decades, these photographs collected inside the so-called Auschwitz album had served, in fact, as the only documented photographs of such places until not that long ago, the director of the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., on a random Tuesday afternoon, received this rather stunning phone call. And on the other end of the line was the voice of this elderly man who said to her at the outset of their conversation, he said, "I think I have something you might be interested in." And she said, "Okay, what is that?" And he went on to explain that as a younger man at the age of 18, he was stationed in Berlin at the end of World War II. And one day, while rummaging through the bombed out remains of an old Reichstag building complex, he found, he said, a photo album that he kept and took home with him and had been keeping in his attic all of these years. But now, as he put it to her, towards the end of his life, he was willing to part with his photo album, and he was offering to donate it to the Holocaust Museum under one condition, he asked, that the donation remain anonymous. She agreed. And some weeks later, this now second photo album arrived at her desk. And it did not take long for her team of historians to go through these photographs to determine that this is now also an extraordinary collection of photographs. All taken at Auschwitz at around the same time as those of the so-called Auschwitz album. But this album is very different. Instead of a collection of photographs depicting the victims of Auschwitz, this is a collection of photographs depicting the perpetrators. That is to say, those who worked there. And when you look at the images inside, they are unbelievable. Laughter, revelry, merriment. You know, in my many years in Holocaust studies, I've had the great fortune of meeting many Holocaust survivors. Some of them, of course, from Auschwitz, some who live here in Atlanta. And all of those who I have met and spoken to who survived Auschwitz, not to put too fine a point on this, but all of them have attested to me, as one survivor put it, that the smell of burning bodies, he said, hung like a dense fog over that terrible place. 24 hours, 7 days a week. That is what they are breathing in. I mean, how do you explain that? Image after image of these laughing, smiling faces, singing songs, playing an accordion. They actually built something of a retreat facility off the camp grounds at Auschwitz. They call it the Solohoitza, named after the river that flows nearby, where workers could relax after a day's work. Here's a photograph on the deck of the Solohoitza where SS Untersturmführer Karl Heuker, the owner of the photo album, in fact, is enjoying blueberries with his female secretarial staff at Auschwitz. We know this because of his many handwritten captions found underneath many of these images. And here is Heuker here on the left, reclining and relaxing here at the Solohoitza with that smile on his face while he's been doing this all day. And again, it begs the question, where does this hatred come from? Right? Why the Jews? No doubt you would well appreciate, and you are fully aware, I'm sure, that when you consider Nazi victimhood, you have to cast a very wide net to include a wide array of people: homosexuals, the Roma and the Sinti, or who are commonly referred to as gypsies, the mentally and physically disabled, communists, Jehovah's Witnesses, the list goes on and on and on. But the Jews held for Hitler and the Nazis a kind of pride of place in their pantheon of hatred. It was utterly central anti-Semitism to their worldview and to their ideology. And it kind of begs the question, why? After all, it's sometimes surprising for students in my Holocaust seminar class at Marist to learn or otherwise consider that there were actually very few Jewish people nationally who lived in Germany at the time. The Jewish population of Germany was in fact less than 1% when Hitler stood on that stage at the Hofbräuhaus and delivered that infamous speech. Take a look at this. This map behind me, this area here shown in blue, represents more or less the furthest extent of Nazi control over continental Europe at the height of their power in the course of World War II, just about right in the middle. And by the spring of 1942, this is just about what the Nazi Empire had looked like. And by that time, by the spring of 1942, the Nazis were finding that it was becoming increasingly more difficult to hold together or otherwise administrate this vast empire that spanned across the whole of continental Europe, seemingly. They were, for example, experiencing acute shortages that were compromising their abilities, not just to hold this empire together, but to continue with the war effort. In fact, many of these problems generated by the size of this empire, many of these shortages that they were experiencing would, in the end, prove to be their undoing. And so it was in the spring of 1942 when Nazi officials were dispatched from Berlin to visit the capital cities of all of Germany's major allies to demand various things needed to help shore up the war effort. And so it was in the spring of 1942 when Nazi officials showed up here in the country of Slovakia, in the capital city of Bratislava. And these Nazi officials, sitting across the table from their counterpart, the president, Josef Tiso of Slovakia at the time, made these various demands of things that were needed. And among the things that these Nazi diplomats demanded were 20,000 male laborers between requisite ages to be displaced into Nazi work camps to be put to work for the war effort. To this, President Tiso asked if they would consider taking 20,000 Jewish men. And these Nazi officials said, fine, you arrest them, you hold them in local internment camps, you police those facilities, and when the time comes, we will send the trains and collect them from there. There were, at about the time, about 90,000 Jewish people who lived in the country of Slovakia. Most of them lived here in Bratislava. So here you have this case in point where an independent foreign country is wanting to rid itself of its own Jewish population. Well, to this, President Tiso, the president of Slovakia, asked these Nazi officials this question. Would you consider, they asked, taking, in addition to those 20,000 male laborers, would you consider taking their wives, their children, their parents? And to this, these Nazi officials said no. Slovakia's time hadn't come yet. And when this request was made by the president of Slovakia to take the women and the children and the elderly, that request was made at a time when Auschwitz was already fully operational, and they knew what was happening there. And they knew, moreover, that the trains carrying the men would be displaced into concentration camps, but the trains carrying the women and the children and the elderly would be sent directly to Auschwitz, where they would be murdered upon arrival. Well, when these Nazi officials said no to this request, President Tiso conferred momentarily with his top aides and advisors and then turned back to these Nazi officials and asked this stunning question. Would you reconsider, he asked, taking the women and the children and the elderly, if we agreed, he said, to pay you some 500 Reichmark apiece for each person taken above the initial 20,000 required forced laborers. These Nazi officials themselves conferred briefly, turned back to President Tiso, faces wreathed in smiles, and said, yes, you have a deal. Contracts were drawn up. Those contracts were signed and found after the war. This is why we know this history. And so here you have a case in point of an independent foreign country, well outside of Hitler's Germany, willing to pay Hitler to murder their own Jews. And again, it begs the question, where does this hatred come from? You know, some years ago, the BBC put together a 5-part documentary series on the history of Auschwitz. It's really quite well done. And for this production, they sent a television crew here to Bratislava to trace this story that I just shared with you. And they met a man there named Mikhail Kabach, who at the time, in 1942, was a member of what was known as the Flinke Guard, sort of the local Nazis. And he was among those who participated in arresting his own Jewish neighbors. He participated in holding them in internment camps there in Bratislava. He participated in looting their homes, smashing into their businesses, stealing cash registers, inventory. He was a perpetrator of the Holocaust. When the time came, he helped get them on those trains and send them to Auschwitz. And he was willing to speak on camera about his involvement in all of this. This is something of a rarity. Perpetrators, as you can well appreciate, are often deeply reticent to speak with anyone about anything concerning what they had done. But Kabach was willing to speak. And I want to play for you just a very short little clip from this interview. And I would ask you to pay less attention to what he says and more attention to how he says it.
A Jew would never go to work. None of them work. They only want.
Can we turn the volume up on that? Does that work?
A Jew would never go to work. None of them. They only want to have an easy life. Our people were happy to receive their stores. We called it Aryanizing. And that's how they became rich.
There's that laughter again. Sorry about the audio. I'm not sure what. Yeah, it's okay. Are you guys able to hear that at all? No, okay. Maybe I should bring my speaker in.
Microphone closer to the speaker on the laptop.
It's resting right on it. Yeah. Okay. All right. It's turned up as loud as it gets. That smile on the face of Mikhail Kabach there. I mean, here's a man who has had a lifetime to reflect on his involvement in one of the greatest mass murders in human history, and he's laughing about it. Laughing about it. And it's the same laughter, isn't it, that we saw on those faces on the guards here at Auschwitz. Or I might say, it's the same smiles and laughter that we saw on the faces of those who marched through Charlottesville, chanting, "The Jews will not replace us." Or the same smiles found on the faces of some of those who stormed the Capitol some time ago. I mean, can you imagine? Camp Auschwitz. Or I might imagine, perhaps, the same smiles on the faces of those who distributed those hideous pamphlets in our own neighborhoods here not that long ago. So this question, why the Jews, as I say, will serve as our guide today and tomorrow as well. I'm wondering if we might just take a 5-minute break so I can bring that speaker in. I think that might help. Also, can we turn the air down? Is it warm in here? Yeah, it feels quite warm in here. Let's do that. I'll be right back. That? All right. Yes. Okay, so sorry about that. I did get here early and I had brought that big speaker in and I set it up with Jason and we did like several audio tests to see how it's working, and we decided to try the interior audio system. It kind of sounded all right when we tested it, but we couldn't hear that. So we'll see. I just have a few other audio clips that are embedded in this presentation. So hopefully that enormous speaker behind me, if I don't trip over it, hopefully that'll work okay. So listen, let's begin. This photograph, by the way, look at this photograph. These children are reading an infamous Nazi anti-Semitic children's book published in the 1930s, one that equated Jews with, of all things, poisonous mushrooms. And I mean, just look at the way they're kind of eating it up. Well, all right, let's begin. We'll start here. Seems as good a place to start as any. In the 16th century, Pope Leo X had a very serious problem. It wasn't his fault, but the problem was that he had just inherited a Vatican treasury that was completely bankrupt, empty. The church was broke. This is a problem when you're tasked with running an organization like this. But as I say, it wasn't his fault. It was the previous pontiff, a guy named Julius II, who had these grandiose visions, Julius did, to rebuild Rome on such a massive scale that Rome would once again become the epicenter of European life and culture as it was during the days of ancient Rome. Has anyone been to Rome before, by the way? Have you been to St. Peter's Basilica in Rome? Okay, is grandiose a good word to use to describe that building? Okay, that building, St. Peter's, had only just begun its construction when the Pope had died and he took over. Just the foundation stones had been laid, and he, Pope Leo X, he had to make a choice as to whether or not he would continue with these wildly ambitious building projects, or should he simply just abort them. And Leo made that fateful choice, fateful at least in the developing course of European history, if not world history, when he decided to go forward with these ambitious building projects and to pay for them by selling, I am not making this up, by selling tickets to heaven. Or what back then they used to call indulgences. Now, of course, in accordance with Catholic theology, what an indulgence is said to do is this. Throughout the course of one's life, we rack up a lot of sin, and upon our deaths, we cannot go to heaven until those sins have been cleansed. And what an indulgence is said to do is to remove years of purgatorial punishment, allowing us to get to heaven sooner. But an indulgence, according to Catholic theology, is something that one ordinarily earns by doing some charitable act or some other act of kindness, but not purchased. And so here the Pope was selling indulgences for money. And so he gathered to Rome, the Pope did, a team of salesmen and put them through like a 6-week crash course on the arts of salesmanship, something he knew a lot about himself, being a member of the Medici family, Europe's wealthiest banking family from Florence. And after this 6-week crash course in salesmanship, he sent these gentlemen forth to visit every village, every hamlet, every city across the sweep of Christendom to sell these indulgences for the building of St. Peter's Basilica. In one of those salesmen he sent forth was an utterly unknown Franciscan friar named John Tetzel, or Johannes Tetzel, whose name, Tetzel's, no doubt would have long ago fallen off the pages of history if it weren't for the great misfortune, at least for Tetzel, to have been sent to the small German town of Wittenberg to sell these indulgences, where, of course, he would run into whom? Yes, Martin Luther. When Tetzel showed up to sell these indulgences here in Wittenberg, Luther, of course, saw this for exactly what it was: complete, unbridled corruption. And Luther, being the famed professor of theology at the University of Wittenberg, was something of a celebrity in the town. He felt, therefore, somewhat responsible for the souls of the good people of Wittenberg. And he felt that it was his responsibility, as I say, to explain to the people of Wittenberg to stay away from Tetzel, to explain that these indulgences hold no efficacy, that they don't work. And of course, as you know, Luther, prior to becoming a priest, a theologian, and a monk, he was a lawyer. And he did as all good lawyers do. He went back to his office there at the University of Wittenberg, and he began writing down arguments against the sale of indulgences. And of course, how many arguments did he come up with? Yes, 95. Luther's famous 95 Theses, which tradition tells us he nailed onto the church door at the cathedral in Wittenberg as a kind of invitation for debate, thus beginning what today we call, of course, the Reformation. Well, why am I telling you this story? Right? What does this have to do with our guiding question? Well, for our purposes together this afternoon, it's highly instructive to note that Luther was perhaps the most important late medieval Christian theologian. He was a professor highly regarded both during his own time and, of course, still today. And he was, therefore, a man who was very careful with his language. What he said, he meant. And what he wrote, he meant. And when you read his writings that have survived from this period, you can feel the intensity with which he is imploring the good people of Wittenberg to stay away from Tetzel. And when you read his writings, time and time again, he refers to Johann Tetzel as a Jew. And he refers to the Vatican in Rome, the seat of the Catholic Church, as the quote unquote synagogue of Satan. Evidently for Luther, nothing could convey his point more clearly to his congregation as to the corruption of the Catholic Church than to associate it with the Jews. You know, not long after Luther posted his 95 Theses, he became quite famous. Thousands, seemingly overnight, began calling themselves Lutherans, which embarrassed him a little bit at first anyway, then he got used to it. And he began to find, particularly towards the latter years of his life, that people were often writing to him, asking Luther for his advice on a wide array of matters. And he often took the time to respond to these inquiries, something of an Ann Landers of sorts. And again, particularly towards the latter years of his life, Luther was receiving a lot of requests from the lords and princes who lived throughout the scattered domains of what was then known as the Holy Roman Empire, today mostly Germany. And these lords and princes who were writing to Luther were asking him for his advice on what they should do with the Jews who lived in their domains. At this time in the 16th century, Jewish people had lived in scattered communities across the whole of Central Europe for several hundred years. And instead of responding to each of these inquiries, Luther leveraged the power of the newly inventing printing press and published a very infamous pamphlet, which he entitled Concerning the Jews and Their Lies, published in 1543. Let me just read for you. I always think I'm going to say this. I was going to say some of the highlights, but let me just read for you some of the lowlights. Let me give you my honest advice. Luther begins. First, their synagogues should be set on fire. And whatever does not burn should be covered or spread over with dirt so that no one will ever have to see a stone or a cinder of these places again. Second, their homes should likewise be broken down and destroyed, for they perpetuate the same things there that they do in their synagogues. For this reason, the Jews ought to be collected and placed under one roof or in a stable, in order that they may realize that they are not masters in our land as they boast, but that they are our miserable captives. Third, the Jews should be deprived of their prayer books and Talmuds in which such idolatry, lies, cursing, and blasphemy are taught. Fourth, their rabbis must be forbidden under the threat of death to teach anymore. Fifthly, traveling and passport privileges should be absolutely forbidden to the Jews. Sixth, the Jews ought to be stopped from lending money. Now, just as an aside, as a footnote, at the time of this writing in the 16th century, the profession of banking was one perceived by Christian authorities to be steeped in greed. And Christians were actually very strongly discouraged from participating in the profession of banking. Of course, to be sure, Europe's wealthiest bankers were Christians, such as the aforementioned Medici. But in some communities, particularly in Central Europe, in the more agrarian reaches of Central Europe, in some communities where Christians were discouraged from banking, and at a time when most major professions were legally closed to Jews, they could not, for example, become members of guilds. They could not, in many communities, own their own land. The list went on and on. But in some communities, there was one profession left available to them, which was to become a small-time money lender. And so Luther says, sixth, the Jews ought to be stopped from lending money, and all their cash and valuable of silver and gold should be taken away from them and put aside for what Luther calls safekeeping. For this reason, as it has been said before, everything the Jews possessed, they stole from us. Seventh, let the young Jew and the Jewess be given the flail, the axe, the hoe, the spade, the spindle, and the distaff. These are farmers' tools. And make them earn their bread by the sweat of their noses. For it is not proper that we should work away the day while they idle away the day at the fireside in laziness, feasting, and display. However, if we are afraid that they may harm us personally, or our wives, or our children, then let us apply the same cleverness as so many nations have already done, such as France, Spain, Bohemia, and let us just drive them out of our lands for all time. For, as it has been said, God's rage is so great against the Jews that they only become worse when we are kind. Therefore, away with them. To sum up, dear princes who have Jews in your domains, if this advice of mine does not suit you, then find a better one, so that you and we may all be free of this insufferable, devilish burden, the Jews. Martin Luther's Concerning the Jews and Their Lies reads like a Nazi manifesto, doesn't it? I mean, everything he's advocating for, the Nazis, of course, would do so many centuries later and more. My students at Marist often ask me whether or not Luther's advice was followed. Yes, overwhelmingly so. But looking at Luther's Concerning the Jews and Their Lies does very little to help us answer our guiding question. That question again being, why the Jews? But it does illustrate, hence my point in having us look at this today. It does illustrate the very same hatred we saw Hitler spewing from that stage at the Hofbrauhaus in Munich in 1919. That hatred is very old and runs very deep in European life and culture. And again, it begs the question, right? Where does this hatred come from? Well, to get at that question, we have to first get at this one. If we can identify properly where we begin to see the first historical evidence of what we might, by consensus, call anti-Semitism, if we can identify where and when it begins, then we can perhaps leverage the tools of the historian to analyze the historical context of the time to help us answer, of course, why. And very often when I raise this question with audiences, I will receive one of these responses. People will talk about slavery in Egypt, or the Assyrian exile, or the Babylonian captivity, or the Persian, Greek, and Roman conquests. Very real historical periods of tremendous suffering on the part of the Jewish people. However, I would argue that these are not great answers to that question. That is to say, these historical periods were not driven by anti-Semitism. For example, the Egyptians did not enslave the Jews because they hated Jews. The Egyptians enslaved the Jews because they had an acute labor shortage and needed their pyramids built. And they were, moreover, enslaving a whole host of other minority groups as well. I think the Roman conquest of Judea is an even greater case in point. Do you remember from your own world history classes back in high school? How massive that Roman Empire had gotten, right? It spanned across the entire Mediterranean world. Well, it would be nonsensical to argue that the Romans conquered Judea because they hated Jews, right? The Romans, we know, conquered Judea because they were extending the ever-growing borders of their empire. And so if these responses don't really work as a proper answer to that question, then what does? Well, the more you trace this history, the more you begin to find some of the clearest, most obvious expressions of a deep, bitter, caustic hatred towards the Jews with the rise of Christianity. And as a Catholic, teaching in a Catholic school, I say that with a very heavy heart. But let's, in what little time we have, let's try to unpack this thesis just a little bit today. And so let's go back to the beginnings of Christianity. Let's go back to Judaism at the time of Christ. When we peek into the world into which Jesus was born and raised, a Jewish world, as you know, that Jewish world in which he lived was made up of a variety of sects. S-E-C-T-S, I have to spell for my students. You've heard of these sects before: the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Zealots, others. And then there was this sect. I will not call them Christians because they did not call them Christians. They called themselves Jews. This would be, of course, those Jews who recognized Jesus as the Messiah. And at the time of Christ, these various groups lived together in a kind of harmony, something of a Venn diagram. And if we were to, drop this down in a timeline, we know that Jesus lived and died here around the year 30. Now, this is not where it begins. This is not where our story starts. The kind of bitter, I think I used the word caustic hatred that I described a few minutes ago does not happen here. It comes later, but not much later. Just a few decades after Jesus' life and death, something happens to this community here that is so catastrophic that it nearly wipes Judaism off the map of history for good. This is not hyperbole. As you know, around the year 70 or thereabouts, the Jews rebelled from Rome. I mean, my goodness, here's Judea here, Jerusalem. I mean, look at what they were rebelling against. Yeah. This is that aforementioned empire I referenced a minute ago. I mean, you gotta kind of give it up to the Jews. I mean, truth be told, they had zero chance for success. And upon this rebellion, the Roman legions were sent in with very clear instructions to kill and destroy. And they killed and they destroyed. Tens of thousands were massacred, thousands more shackled and hauled off into slavery, thousands dispersed across the Mediterranean world, the beginnings, as you know, of the diaspora. And of course, the city of Jerusalem, in the epicenter of Jewish life and culture, the Temple of Solomon, was destroyed. The Romans, of course, burned anything that would burn. They hauled off anything of monetary value back to Rome. And then they painstakingly broke this temple apart block by block and hauled these blocks off to be used in various building projects. Of course, as you know, there's one remnant of that wall here that remains standing. The Western Wall. I mean, my goodness. To touch those stones, it's extraordinary, isn't it? But getting back to our story, in the wake of this catastrophe, there would be only two Jewish groups who would survive going forward. And that would be these two groups here. The Pharisees and these Jews for Jesus. This is when it begins. This is when the roots of this tension begins to take hold, which will grow into something entirely unintended. What happens in short is this, and this is something of an oversimplification, I confess. But both of these two Jewish communities here are utterly desperate to ensure the survival of their thousands-year-old Jewish tradition. The problem, however, is that in order to ensure the survival of their faith tradition, they both want to take Judaism in very different directions. And all of us clearly understand the fault line that divided them both. It was over the question of the messiahship of Jesus. Was he the Messiah or was he not? One community says yes. The other community, of course, says no. And you have these two very now divergent communities, locked, as it were, in this vicious debate over truth. And regrettably, it was at this time, and not earlier, when this community here does this. They write their gospel accounts. And as we would well imagine, the Pharisees do not come off looking very good in these gospel narratives, to be sure. We know for certain that these gospels have a profoundly anti-Pharisaic position, which is really reflective of the climate in which they were written. Here's an example. This is from the Gospel of Matthew. In this passage, Jesus is speaking here in the temple. That temple, of course, that was destroyed some years after his life. And according to this account, he's teaching to a small audience who is seated here at his feet. And then suddenly, a group of Pharisees show up. We might think of them as rabbis. And Jesus turns his attention away from those who he is speaking to, and he launches into this attack against the Pharisees. And so he says, "And whoever exalts himself shall be humbled, and whoever humbles himself shall be exalted." But, he says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you shut off the kingdom of heaven from men, for you do not enter in yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you travel about on sea and land to make one convert, and when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint, dill, and cumin, and have neglected the weightier provisions of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you clean the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside they are full of robbery and self-indulgence. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which on the outside appear beautiful, but inside are full of dead men's bones and all decay. Consequently, you bear witness against yourselves that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets. You serpents, you brood of vipers, how shall you escape the sentence of hell? It's what we call a rhetorical question. The implication being that, of course, they will not escape the sentence of hell. Passages like this one, found in the Gospel of Matthew, is, I should stress, consistent with the anti-Pharisaic position that the writers of this gospel are taking. But I have to stress to you that biblical scholars today recognize, both within the Catholic Church and beyond, that passages like this one are not representative of Jesus' actual teachings. He would not have spoken this way against the Pharisees. His teachings, we know, Jesus' teachings, were essentially Pharisaic. That is to say, Jewish. He would not have spoken like this against the Pharisees. Instead, what we're hearing in passages like this one is an argument being put forth against their theological opponents by a community that is utterly desperate to legitimize their belief in Christ, and they seek to do so by delegitimizing, in fact, even demonizing, their theological opponents. And this language, you serpents, you brood of vipers, how shall you escape the sentence of hell? The bitter, I'll use the word again, caustic language, it should be noted, is typical of the time. At this time, in the first century, this is very often how communities engaged in such debates, by using such language. And that is largely because, it's like this language strikes our ear today as unbelievably harsh, right? I mean, I run a program at Marist that we call Piece by Piece. And it's this extraordinary program where I select 15 Catholic students from Marist, and we partner, of course, with the Weber School, and their director selects 15 Jewish students. And our third partner school, a school called Davidi Muhammad in Decatur, their director selects 15 Muslim students. And throughout the course of the academic year, though we got sidelined due to COVID and we're working to bring it back, but throughout the course of the academic year, we bring these 45 students together for conversation, fellowship, dialogue. It's extraordinary. And when these kids gather together, they find that within each other's faith traditions, there is such goodness, truth, beauty found in these traditions. But that point of view is a very modern one. We live in a very post-Enlightenment world where we tend to think that oftentimes that truth is relative. But back then, very different. Back then in the first century, their brains were wired entirely different from our own. For them, truth was absolute, not relative. There could only be one true faith, which comes from God. Everything else comes from Satan. Hence this bitter, caustic language that we find being hurled against their theological opponents. But look, I want to stress that it's not really to the Pharisees that this community is speaking to. Who they're really speaking to with this language is this group here that kind of sits in the middle. Those who are, for lack of a better phrase, kind of on the fence about this whole Jesus thing. Is he the Messiah or is he not? One group, of course, says yes. Another group says no. But then there's this group in the middle who's like, I'm not sure yet. This is who they're speaking to in these gospel accounts. And they're essentially saying, look, if you go with them, this is where you'll end up. But look, it's all well and good to try to analyze the historical context of these passages, to try to make sense out of why they're written the way that they are. But here's the problem. This passage becomes gospel. And today, of course, if you look up this word in Webster's dictionary, guess what definition you get? Right, the Pharisees were not self-righteous hypocrites. They were just Jews who did not believe that Jesus was the Messiah. Sound familiar? That's it. Yet they're accused of such things by a community that is desperate, as I say, to assert the legitimacy of their belief. Let's look at just one more. This from the Gospel of John. Here it says, Jesus was therefore saying to whom? What does it say there? Yes, to the Jews. Now, let me just take a second to put this into context for a minute. The Gospel of Matthew, which we just looked at previously, was written more or less around this period. It was one of the earlier of the 4 gospel accounts that was written. And when it was written, the debate that rocked this community here was between these two. And so in the Gospel of Matthew, the theological opponents of theirs are the Pharisees. The Gospel of John, however, was written just a little bit later. And in that time, this community is undergoing a tremendous transformation, where increasingly more and more pagans, Greeks, Romans, are now converting to this faith, mostly due to the proselytizing efforts of Paul and many others, who go into the Greek world to convert former pagans, who now have absolutely no familial connection whatsoever with Judaism. This is the community here who's writing the Gospel of John. And for them, their theological opponents are no longer the Pharisees. It's just the Jews. And so again, it says, Jesus was therefore saying to the Jews, if you abide in my word, then you're truly disciples of mine in the truth. You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. They answered him, we are Abraham's children and have never yet been enslaved by anyone. What do you mean by saying you shall be made free? Jesus answered them, truly I say to you, anyone who commits sin is a slave to sin. If therefore the Son shall make you free, you shall be free indeed. But you seek to kill me, because my word has no place in you. I speak the things I have seen from my Father. You, Jews, you do the things you have seen from your father. They answered and said to him, Abraham is our father. Jesus said to them, if you are Abraham's children, do the deeds of Abraham. But as it is, you are seeking to kill me, a man who has told you the truth, which I heard from God. This Abraham would not do. You are doing the deeds of your father. And they're like, what are you talking about? They say, we were not born of fornication. We have one Father, God. Jesus said to them, If God were your father, you would love me. And he asks, why do you not understand what I am saying? And this is the answer he gives to that question. It is because you cannot hear my word. You are of your father, the devil, and you want to do the desires of your father. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth because there is not truth in him. He who is of God hears the word of God. For this reason, you do not hear them because you are not of God. And again, it's essential to emphasize that, again, passages like these are not representative of Jesus's teachings. Simply put, he would not have spoken this way about Jews, being Jewish himself. And again, instead, what we're hearing in passages like this is this attempt by this very early Christian community to demonize their theological opponents, those who are denying the essential truth of their faith. But again, here's the problem. If we just go forward just a little bit now further in time, there's now a complete severance between these two communities. And you now have very early Christian theologians from this period here reading these gospel accounts that we just looked at together. People like the very influential St. John Chrysostom from the 4th century, who at the time was the head of Christianity as the Patriarch of Constantinople, who just read the very passage from the Gospel of John that we looked at together, then preached this from the pulpit at the cathedral in Constantinople. But the Jews, he says, will no doubt say that they too worship God. Heaven forbid them to say so. No Jew worships God. Who says so? The Son of God. Quote, if you knew my Father, he says, you would know me too. But you neither know me nor do you know my Father. And he asks, what sort of evidence can I produce that's more trustworthy than the gospel? If then the Jews don't recognize the Father, if they crucified the Son, who wouldn't be bold enough to declare that their synagogues are the resting place of demons? I had said, kind of at the outset of this presentation, that we begin to find some of the best examples of a deep, bitter hatred towards the Jews because of their Jewishness with the rise of Christianity. This is a case in point. Chrysostom, of course, has absolutely no understanding of the historical context of these passages. He is simply just pulling these passages from the pages and using them in this manner. And this question he asks, right, what sort of evidence can I produce that's more trustworthy than the gospel? You know, as a Catholic, I would tell you that the Gospels are trustworthy. There's a reason why the Gospels have endured for as long as they have. People read these stories, perhaps not the ones we've looked at today, but people read these stories and find in them such extraordinary examples of forgiveness, service, submission, acceptance, encouragement, values deeply rooted in the Jewish faith. Yes? But it would surprise none of you. Look, we live in Georgia. We know this history. It would surprise none of you to hear an educator say that the Gospels, the Bible, has been used in history to justify hatred. It was used here in Georgia to justify slavery. It was used to justify, it is often used to justify a kind of homophobia, an oppression of women, and anti-Semitism. But I would argue that the Gospels were never written intended to justify oppression, hatred. If they were, I couldn't call myself a Christian. But these passages are profoundly troubling. Because, not to be outdone, here's Martin Luther preaching on the very same passages, now 1,000 years after Chrysostom. During this first century of Christianity, early Christian theologians will develop two ideas, two theological concepts that will become central to Christian self-understanding. We'll call them the dual myth. They will, however, regrettably, become two ideas that will become pillars upon which a foundation, a nearly 2,000-year-old tradition of Christian anti-Semitism will be built. The first of these two ideas comes from a story. And it's a story that Christians are so familiar with. Nearly anyone could come up here in front of the room and recount that story for those who identify as Christian. It's this story here.
Eros Malaka, Lakaskas Dimbenas Na. Wana, Lakaskake Dira. Yung gawa les sagana ro. Yerin kong di kuspera at gipilton ave prasata. Yang anak na nakasimbay esuri. Rasakay dia, Baba. băi în ton de Cristo. Răsăca baraba? O Iesua, Cri Meșiaha. Ula, Meșiaha. Ula, Muhammed. Te ții baraba.
This, of course, is the story of what in the Christian community we refer to as the Passion. This clip comes from a film called The Passion of the Christ. Came out, as you may remember, many years ago. And the reason why I'm sharing this clip with you is because what Mel Gibson has done with this film, together with his team of producers, is that he has created on film a perfect reconstruction of how this story is told in the gospel narratives. And so short of reading the text together this afternoon, we can watch this clip to have a very clear sense out of how this story is told in the gospel accounts. And as this clip plays, I want you to have your antennae sensitive to this question, not that it needs to be, but that question is this. According to how the story is told, who is responsible for the death of Christ?
Yes. Volevo questi grazie per sedere si chiamava se non il simbolo Eus è un cucino.
So Pontius Pilate, the procurator, that is to say, governor of Judea, has Jesus sent to be scourged, whipped, in hopes that he can represent Jesus to this bloodthirsty mob, in hopes that this might satisfy their bloodthirstiness. It should be noted that according to the account, it was the Jewish authorities who the word is in the gospel narratives. It was the Jewish authorities who delivered is the word they use, Jesus to Pontius Pilate.
Poteste se sui per il procedibile verità. Am tutte che oggi paese, a dove a masa come ma che hanno
Do as they wish. It is impossible to read this story in the gospel narratives and not draw the conclusion that it is the Jews who are responsible for the death of Christ. The story is intended, it's written that way. But the story as it's written, of course, is impossible to accept from an historical perspective. Simply put, this is just not how Roman jurisprudence worked. Of the governor of Judea, these so-called procurators, they would not arrest people who were accused of treason, after all, and gather mobs outside their palaces and ask the mob, what do you guys want me to do with him? Here's how the story is written in the Gospel of Matthew. Here's these details that we saw in the piece. Pilate said to them, whom do you want me to release for you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ? We saw that in the scene. And they all said, crucify him. And he said, why? What evil has he done? And they shouted all the more, saying, crucify him. And when Pilate saw that he could do nothing and that a riot was starting, he took water and washed his hands. What does that mean, of course? I wash my hands of this, which is where that expression comes from. Saying, I am innocent of this man's blood, see to it yourselves. Then there is this line found only in the Gospel of Matthew. It's a line that follows here. And it is, moreover, a line that will bring more suffering, violence on the part of Jewish people, perpetrated by Christians through the centuries. It's this line here. And all the people answered him and said, his blood be on us and on our children. And again, it's impossible to accept the crowd shouting back to Pilate, his blood be on us and on our children, right? But here is how, or rather why, this line becomes so profoundly damaging. Early Christian theologians, and if we had time, we would see this in their writings, but early Christian theologians will interpret this line to say this: his blood be on us and our descendants, meaning all Jews who have ever lived and will ever live are collectively responsible for the death of Christ. I had lunch last summer with a Holocaust survivor from Romania, and we were chatting about his high school years. And he said to me, this will not surprise you. He said, Brendan, I was one of very few Jewish students at my high school. You know what they called me, he asked? Christ killer. That was my nickname. Largely because of how that story is told. And, we just don't have time to talk about why it's written the way that it is. But largely because of the way it's written, it gives rise to the first of these two myths, which is this accusation that it is the Jews who are responsible for the death of Christ, known in academic circles as the myth of deicide. Suicide, the death of oneself; deicide, the death of a deity, a god. And here's how far this accusation will be carried. Now, just try to wrap your head around this. Early Christian theologians will say that the Jews killed Christ because they knew who he was. That's why they did it. Because Jews are so essentially demonic that they desire nothing more than to kill God. That's how far and how damaging this accusation becomes. And the second of these two myths will be equally as damaging as the first. The second of these two myths essentially says that the covenant forged between God and his chosen people, a covenant, of course, meant to last for eternity, has in fact been broken. And the Jews are now cursed, condemned, rejected by God. Largely, though not exclusively, but largely because of this. And moreover, a now new covenant has been forged with Christianity or with Christians. And the second of these two myths then is this idea that the covenant has now been passed, known again in academic circles as the myth of supersession. To supersede, of course, as you know, it means to replace with something better. And the reason why I say this second of these two myths will be equally as condemning as the first is because it essentially puts forth the idea that God has rejected the Jews, and so too must we. And so these two ideas, developed very early in the first centuries of Christianity, will become two ideas that will lead to centuries of tremendous suffering. Where does Martin Luther, how does Martin Luther justify advocating for burning their homes, burn their synagogues, expel them from our lands? It's coming from these two ideas. In what little time we have left, I want to share something with you. And I confess that we're at about 5 minutes till, but this will take us about 10 minutes. But we were interrupted, so I'm stealing 5 more minutes from you. What I want to share with you is going to take us away from these early decades and into what's called the patristic period. And I want to share with you a homily, a sermon delivered by one of the giants of this so-called patristic period, from the Latin word for father. This is that moment when a faith becomes a church, led by the so-called founding fathers of Christianity. Among them was St. John Chrysostom, who we have introduced ourselves to before. Many of Chrysostom's homilies have survived. This one, I want us to take a peek at. And let me just set the context for you. Chrysostom is the patriarch of Constantinople. He's the head of Christianity. This is before the position of Pope became preeminent. And he has a problem. The problem, which he addresses in his homily, is that it has come to his attention that Christian members of his congregation have been going into the Jewish neighborhood of Constantinople during their annual celebrations of Passover. There was at the time a very small Jewish neighborhood on the east end of the city. And so he has delivered this homily as a warning to the members of his congregation to do not do that. And I want to share with you this homily. I'll need some help passing these out. And yep. Thank you so much. We'll need like 3 or 4 people. Just come up. And so what I'm going to ask you to do is just to read, just grab as many as you can. Just to read just the parts that I've highlighted here for you in bold. That way we can read this quite quickly. But I want you to have, once again, your antennae sensitive to this question that I will ask you in 4 minutes, 3 minutes. That question is this. In your opinion, what is the worst thing Chrysostom says? Okay? So I'm going to ask you for your response to this question. What is the worst thing Chrysostom says? Sure. Can we turn the house lights up while they read? His homily begins there on page 2. And I have just a very brief introductory paragraph in italics, which just tells you a little bit about Chrysostom. We're trying to turn the house lights up. And then again, you can just read those parts that I've highlighted for you in bold to give you a sense of what he has to say in this homily. Mhm. You can turn all the lights up as much as you can. Perfect. So again, in your view, what is I don't know how else to put this, but what is the worst thing Chrysostom says and why? Thank you, guys. That's perfect. Thank you. Just about one more minute. I see some hands going up already. I love it. All right. So let me ask. Yes, ma'am. In your view, what is the worst thing Chrysostom says and why?
Paragraph 6.
You can just read it for us. Go ahead. Although such beasts are unfit for work, they are fit for killing.
They can fit for sport.
It hardly needs to be said, but why was that line for you the worst thing Chrysostom says?
If it says stage for a halt.
It sets the stage for a Holocaust, you say? Yes. Thank you. Yes, sir.
I have the same conclusion.
Okay. Does anyone have a different line that stood out to you? Yes, ma'am.
His blood be upon us and our children.
Okay, so he's quoting that line from the Gospel of Matthew, where the crowd shouts back, "His blood be on us and on our children." Thank you. Yes, sir. They slew God. Why for you was that line, which is very similar to the previous one? Why was that the worst for you?
God by definition is our faith, our deity.
Right.
Have someone be accused, playing God our good.
Yes, good, thank you. Let's just do a couple more. Yes, ma'am. When God forsakes a people, Chrysostom says, what hope of salvation is left? And why that line? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So, yes, exactly. So his homily is steeped in exactly what you're talking about, the myth of deicide, that the Jews are Christ killers. And it's also steeped in the second myth of supersession. Read that line again. They're cursed and rejected. That's the myth of supersession. One more. Yes, sir.
They killed their children.
Say that again loudly.
They killed their children.
They killed their children. Right. So I want to be cognizant of your time. It is just about 5 minutes past, but let me just say this before we go. My intention today was to trace the origins of this, what you just read. If we had more time, we could do this a little bit more thoroughly, but 4 hours is enough to be fair. But you can see how this develops just in a couple hundred years' time into a homily like that. Do you see that? Right? So what we really wanted to do in part 1 today is just to kind of set the stage for this tragedy that will unfold tomorrow night in part 2. Okay? And it's so profoundly rooted in these 2 essential ideas, the myth of supersession and the myth of deicide. And I'll just leave you with this, because I think this is worth noting since this is where we are right now, emotionally, mentally. But it is important to note, we'll expand on this tomorrow evening for what it's worth, that the Catholic Church has officially rejected these 2 teachings, both the teachings of supersession and the teaching of deicide, in a landmark statement announced in the 1960s, not coincidentally, right after the Holocaust, in a landmark statement known as Nostra Aetate. But as I say, we'll talk about that tomorrow. Okay. Listen, I do apologize for that disruption earlier. We did work on the audio prior and it seemed to be working okay, but it just didn't work out, did it? But we've got that sorted. So thank you guys for coming. Thank you. And again, I just want to remind you that we'll have about a half hour for a conversation together through Q&A at the end of the presentation tomorrow night, because we want to hear from each other. Okay? Thank you, guys.
Excuse me. Thank you so much, Mr. Murphy. And we have some refreshments in the social hall if anyone would like to grab a little nosh before you hit the road. And we will see you tomorrow evening, 7 p.m.
Perfect.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
To clarify, there seems to be some confusion. Tomorrow's evening, we are here from 7 to 9, 7 p.m.